My name is Julie Quinn, 29 years old. The morning that asked me to choose who I was smelled like cold leaves and metal rails, October light rinsing the city in a clean, gold hush. I could hear my father's old verdict even before I was fully awake. William Parker's voice, clipped as a ruler's edge. Don't waste time on street vets. They made their bed. Let them lie in it. For years, I mistook obedience for love and silence for respect. But that morning, with a navy dress on a hanger and a cashmere scarf soft as breath across my palms, the sentence clanged in my head like a lock I was suddenly brave enough to test. I'd just finished 6 months with the Marines Community Outreach Program in North Carolina. Paperwork by day, midnight coffee with men and women whose hands still shook when doors slammed. Useful work, I thought. A waste of your degree, my father said. He loved me, I know he did, but he measured worth like a stock chart. Sharp climbs, no softness. Now I was supposed to meet another man who worshipped clocks and control, Arthur Sterling, the reclusive billionaire who scared both reporters and sons into immaculate posture. His son, my fiancé, David, had coached me like a drill instructor the night before. This isn't dinner, it's inspection. No Marines talk. No charity, art, travel, markets. 5 minutes early or don't come at all. He kissed my forehead afterward, but his eyes never unclenched. I pressed the navy dress, steamed it twice, and slid the scarf around my neck. The cashmere was cream, weightless, unnecessarily expensive. David had whispered the number like an incantation that could buy entry. You look powerful, he'd said, but soft. I laughed then, but as I took the early train north, I rehearsed lines the way a novice rehearses prayers. Tasteful, agreeable, non-threatening. The window traded city grit for clipped hedges and stone lions on pillars, the kind that whispered old money into any ear that passed. Every mile tightened the band across my ribs. The station at Sterling's Town looked like it had been oiled every morning since 1912. The taxi stand was empty. I checked my watch. If I walked, I'd still be 5 minutes early. He believes punctuality is the measure of a person's mind, David had said. I started down the immaculate sidewalk, heels sketching neat little sermons on punctuality into the cobblestone. Houses sat on lawns so precise you could fold them. The sky was a clear pane. That's when the pane cracked. A man sat alone on a bench beneath a skeletal maple, shoulders hunched, coat thinned to memory, hands trembling the way hands do after too much winter and not enough names. It wasn't the wear that stopped me. It was the dull shine at his throat. Dog tags. Marine. My body stalled. My father's sentence marched through my head, brisk and final. Then, like a second voice catching the first by the collar, I heard my grandfather's laughter-worn baritone, the voice that used to wrap me in wool blankets and stories from Korea. A Marine never leaves another Marine behind, not even in peace. I had a neat little train lunch sandwich in my tote. I had a scarf worth more than a month's rent in my first apartment. I had 5 extra minutes and a lifetime of being told what mattered. I walked over. Sir, I said softly, you okay? He looked up, not vacant, not dazed, blue eyes, clear and assessing, intelligence quiet as a blade. Just cold, ma'am, he said, a gravel kindness under the words. Missed the soup line today. I took out the sandwich and held it out like an apology for the whole world. Turkey and Swiss, I said. Not much, but it's yours. He accepted it carefully, like you hold a thing you don't want to bruise. Thank you. His fingers shook. Before I could tally the cost, I unwound the scarf and draped it over his shoulders. The cream lit the gray of his coat like early snow. You sure? He asked, looking at me as if I might yank it back and call this a test. You need it more than I do. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He nodded, eyes wet but not pleading. You're a good one, he murmured. Then, barely above breath, a password. Semper Fi. I glanced at my watch. 5:12 p.m. A shot of panic. 17 minutes late. David's warning detonated in my chest. I squeezed his hand once. No, that's wrong. I only imagined it. I squeezed my tote instead, whispered, stay warm, and started to run. By the time I reached the iron gates of Sterling Manor, my lungs were a furnace and my hair had decided its own weather. The intercom cracked. Miss Parker? The voice could have chilled wine. Yes, I gasped. Here to see Mr. Sterling. Silence stretched until I could hear my pulse in my jaw. The gates exhaled and swung wide. The driveway cut through lawns manicured into obedience. The mansion rose, white and deliberate, all columns and windows that didn't blink. David waited on the steps. Perfect suit, imperfect eyes. Even at a distance, I could see the fury he tried to press into a polite smile. "Julie," he hissed when I reached him, "where have you been?" There was a man outside the station. He looked cold and... 17 minutes, he said, as if the number itself were obscenity. Do you understand what that means here? To whom? I asked, breathing hard. My father. The words were tight as a choke chain. He believes tardiness is a sign of a disordered mind. He was a veteran, I said, softer now. A Marine. David stared like I'd confessed a crime. You stopped for a homeless man on your way to meet Arthur Sterling. He scanned me, eyes sharpening. Where's the scarf, the cashmere? Where is it? I gave it to him, I said. He was freezing. He let out a strangled laugh, something between shock and a plea. You gave away a $700 scarf to a... Julie, do you realize how this looks? I wasn't thinking about how it looks, I said. I was thinking about doing the right thing, he finished, bitter and frightened. The right thing is showing up on time, ready to impress the man who holds our future in his hands. Heat rose to my face, not shame, but the exhaustion of explaining kindness to someone in a burning house. Then maybe the man I need to impress isn't the one you think. For a heartbeat, hurt flickered across his features, real as breath. He loved me. He also loved the rules that had kept him safe from his father's contempt. Those two loves had never shaken hands. The butler appeared in the doorway, tall as a cathedral and twice as silent. Mr. Sterling will see you now. Inside, the house was a museum of men who stared from gilded frames as if the paint itself were a contract. Marble floors gleamed with self-respect. The air held its breath. Our shoes counted off our approach like a metronome. David's precise, mine a step behind, learning the rhythm of a world that wanted to see whether I would ask permission to exist. We reached 2 mahogany doors. They opened soundlessly, and the dining room unfurled. Long table like a runway of polished night, chandeliers dripping constellations, candles burning with the patience of old money. At the far end, a single figure sat, head bowed slightly, hands resting where a judge might place them. David inhaled. There he is, he whispered. Don't speak unless spoken to. Smile. Be... I didn't hear the last word. The man looked up. Blue eyes, quiet intelligence, a cream scarf resting on his shoulders like a benediction. My breath fell through me. I swayed, steadied. David kept walking, oblivious, rehearsing an introduction like reciting a spell. Father, he said, voice turned to glass. This is... Arthur Sterling did not look at his son. He looked at me, and a small smile altered the weather of the room. Miss Quinn, he said, voice low enough to trust. We meet again. David stopped. Again? What do you... Arthur lifted a hand, the slightest tide. Appearances deceive, David. You'd do well to remember that. Then, to me, warm as a hearth relit, your kindness preceded you. The butler pulled a chair at the head of the table. Arthur nodded toward it. Sit by me, Miss Quinn. You've earned the seat of honor tonight. The sentence rang like the softest bell. Somewhere in the portrait-lined dark, I felt my grandfather's smile. David stood still, skin bleached of color, every lesson he'd ever learned about control suddenly complicated by a scarf. I walked the long length of polished wood, the floor cool and sane beneath my heels, my heart a startled animal that, for once, had no desire to flee. I sat. Arthur's gaze held mine, not invasive, not appraising, but precise, like a craftsman measuring the grain before the first cut. In that gaze was a question I hadn't expected from a man like him. Who are you when no one applauds? The room was silent in that expensive way where silence is the most costly thing. David took his place far down the table, a man left standing at his own altar. The butler poured wine. Arthur inclined his head toward me, as if we were conspirators in a small, brave crime. You broke a rule today, he said, conversational, almost amused. I did, I answered, pulse finally finding a rhythm, and I would do it again. Good, he said softly. Some rules exist to guard power. The better ones exist to guard people. I could feel the house listening. I could feel my father's verdict slacken, thread by thread. I could feel the $700 scarf become something else entirely, Not proof of taste, but a flag planted where I'd decided, without asking permission, to be the person I said I was. The butler set a plate before me, steam rising like a blessing that didn't care who had paid for the lamb. Arthur lifted his glass, the crystal catching a small universe of light. To punctuality, he teased, the corner of his mouth tilting. To priorities, I said. He touched his glass to the air between us. To priorities. Somewhere deep inside the marble and the portraits and the practiced stillness, a new compass swung, and I felt it settle true. I hadn't come here to win an empire. I'd come to learn whether character had a seat at this table, and the man in the scarf had just made room. The next morning felt different, like the air itself was holding its breath. I woke before sunrise, the city still wrapped in the kind of silence that doesn't want to be disturbed. My phone buzzed once, David's name on the screen. The message was short, stiff. Father wants to see you again. Alone, noon. My stomach turned, but I typed back, I'll be there. When I arrived, the Sterling estate was stripped of last night's grandeur. The lights were dim, the windows gray with morning fog. The butler met me at the door with the same immaculate posture, but his voice was gentler. Mr. Sterling is in his study, Miss Quinn. He asked that you come straight in. The study was unlike the dining hall. Smaller, warmer, smelling faintly of tobacco and paper. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, old volumes bound in worn leather. Sunlight struggled through the heavy drapes, scattering across brass picture frames. In one of them, I saw a much younger Arthur in a navy uniform, his smile quiet but real. He stood by the window when I entered, his reflection caught between glass and shadow. Miss Quinn, he said without turning, thank you for coming. Oh. Of course. He faced me then, and for a moment, he didn't look like a billionaire or a myth. He looked like a man who had lived long enough to understand the cost of being powerful. I imagine last night was unexpected, he began, a trace of amusement behind his composure. That's one way to describe it, I said carefully. I'm still not sure I understand what happened. Arthur gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. Sit, I'll explain. I did, smoothing my dress, as if that could steady me. He studied me the way someone studies a photograph they've already memorized, searching for something they missed the first time. You remind me of my wife, he said suddenly. She used to say, Arthur, the richest man in the room is the one who still knows how to be kind. I never listened. I was too busy winning. His gaze drifted to the photograph on his desk, a woman in a pale dress, her smile the kind that didn't ask for attention. When she died, he continued, I stopped hearing her voice. Then yesterday, a stranger offered me a sandwich and a scarf, and for a moment I heard her again. I didn't know what to say, so I said the truth. I didn't know it was a test. That's precisely why you passed. His eyes sharpened, though his tone stayed soft. I've spent years watching people perform goodness when it's convenient. You acted when it wasn't. I needed to see that kind of courage again. He walked to a small cabinet, poured coffee into 2 porcelain cups, and slid one toward me. I'm rebuilding a foundation, the Sterling Veterans Initiative. We fund transitional housing, job training, and mental health care for service members. But the truth is, it's become a boardroom trophy, too polished, too detached. He leaned forward slightly. I want you to lead it. The words landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Me? I asked, almost whispering. I'm not. You're exactly what it needs, he interrupted. Someone who still believes people are worth saving, even when there's no applause for it. I hesitated. David said you hate lateness more than dishonesty. You're not angry I broke your rule? Arthur smiled faintly. I wrote that rule when I thought control was the same thing as order. I've been rewriting my rules ever since. Silence pooled between us, comfortable this time. I took a sip of the coffee. Strong, bitter, unpretentious. It felt like something earned. I'll think about it, I said finally. Good, he replied, but I caught a glimmer in his eye that said he already knew my answer. I took the train back to the city with the proposal sealed in an envelope on my lap. The sun had climbed higher now, brushing light across the window glass. I kept seeing Arthur's eyes, the same ones that had looked through me at dinner, steady and knowing. At home, David was waiting. He stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, tie undone, pacing like someone holding bad news in his mouth. How did it go? He asked. I set the envelope on the counter. He offered me a position, to run the Veterans Foundation. His jaw tightened. He what? He said he wants someone who understands the work, someone with real experience. David's laugh was short and sharp. So, what? He's just skipping over his entire executive team to hire you? I folded my arms. It's not about titles, David. It's about purpose. Purpose, he repeated, as if testing whether the word still belonged in our shared vocabulary. You think you're the first person he's ever praised for doing something good? My father collects people like medals when it suits him. That's not what this is, I said quietly. He looked at me, eyes caught between fear and pride. Maybe not to you, but to him, it's all performance. You're just the latest example. His words stung, not because I believed them, but because they revealed something deeper. He was terrified that I'd passed a test he couldn't even see. I didn't ask for any of this, I said. I know, he murmured, voice breaking. That's what scares me. He left before I could answer. The door clicked shut like a period on a sentence I wasn't ready to end. The following week, I started work at the Sterling Foundation. The office sat on the top floor of a glass building that looked out over the Hudson, sunlight spilling across clean desks and carefully chosen art. Arthur's name was everywhere, but he rarely appeared. He let me work in peace, sending only short notes in his tight, deliberate handwriting. Trust your instincts, lead quietly. Results follow. I spent my days with veterans whose stories could crush or resurrect you in a single breath. I learned their rhythms, the way some paused before saying home, the way others joked too loudly just to fill the silence. I sat with one man named Torres who hadn't slept indoors in 2 years. He said roofs made him claustrophobic. We found him a counselor and a room with a skylight. A week later, he brought me a paper star he'd folded from a bus ticket. For luck, he said. Sometimes, after everyone left, I'd stand by the window and think about my father, about how easily he dismissed people like Torres. I wondered if he'd ever realized that success without compassion was just dressed-up loneliness. One evening, as I packed up to leave, the door creaked open. Arthur stepped in, no entourage, no announcement. He looked tired but content. Progress, he asked. Real progress, I said, but it's slow. Good things always are. He looked around the office. The photos, the open files, the faint smell of coffee and purpose. You've given this place life again, Julie. I smiled. You gave me the chance. He shook his head. You gave me the reminder. He turned to go, but paused. One more thing. There are people who will resent you for this. People who built careers on pretending to care. Don't let their noise distract you. I wanted to ask if he meant David. I didn't. By the third week, the boardroom felt colder. I could sense it in the glances that slid across polished tables, in the whispered meetings that stopped when I entered. A man named Langford, one of the senior directors, smiled too often and too thinly. During a budget review, he said, Miss Quinn, some of us wonder whether this foundation's heartwarming optics are overshadowing our investors' expectations. I met his gaze evenly. If you're asking whether helping veterans threatens your portfolio, then maybe we need different investors. The room went silent. Arthur, seated at the head, hid a smirk behind his coffee cup. After the meeting, as I stepped into the hallway, I caught the echo of Langford's voice. Low, clipped. She'll burn out fast. They always do. Maybe he was right, but if burning was the price of light, I'd pay it. That night, I found Arthur standing alone in the empty corridor, hands clasped behind his back, staring at an old black and white photo of soldiers lined shoulder to shoulder. You heard him, he said without looking at me. I did. He nodded. Langford thinks decency is bad business. He's been trying to prove it for 30 years. Then maybe it's time someone proved him wrong. Arthur glanced over, his eyes soft with something like pride. That's exactly what I hired you for. He walked away, leaving the faint scent of cedar and tobacco in the air. I stood there a long time, watching the reflection of my own face in the glass frame. Tired, determined, changed. Somewhere deep down, I realized this was no longer about impressing anyone. It was about proving that kindness could survive in a world built to punish it. And I intended to prove it, even if it meant standing alone. By the time autumn tipped toward winter, the Sterling Foundation had begun to feel like both battlefield and home. The air inside those glass walls buzzed with ambition, but underneath, there was something else, a quiet resistance I couldn't name yet. Arthur's weekly notes had grown shorter, but more personal. Keep leading with conscience, one said. Another simply read, Don't flinch when they do. I pinned them to the edge of my corkboard, tiny anchors in a sea of numbers and deadlines. David, meanwhile, had grown more distant. His texts came late and ended too quickly. When he did visit, he looked around the office like a stranger surveying a rival's territory. I tried to tell myself it was stress, that he'd come around, but every time I said that, my voice sounded like someone else's lie. Then came the dinner invitation. Arthur's embossed stationery carried the weight of an unspoken challenge. Formal dinner. Saturday, 7 p.m. Attendance expected. David frowned when he read it. He's doing it again. Doing what? Testing people, you, me, everyone. Just be careful. I studied him. Careful of what? He hesitated, the truth flickering and retreating. Of becoming what he wants. It was such an odd warning that I didn't know how to answer. That Saturday, the Sterling mansion blazed like a ship on calm seas, windows aglow, laughter echoing faintly through the open doors. I recognized the difference instantly. This wasn't a private family dinner. It was theater. Inside the dining hall, the table stretched like an accusation. At Arthur's right sat 3 men and 2 women in tailored suits, the Foundation's senior board, the kind of people whose smiles weighed something. At his left sat 1 empty chair. Mine. David guided me toward it, his hand resting lightly on my back, a gesture that felt more choreographed than affectionate. Just stay polite, he whispered. Arthur rose as we approached, smiling warmly enough to melt every layer of tension but one. Ah, Miss Quinn, the woman of the hour. Please sit. I did, aware of the murmured greetings that followed my name like soft thunder. Wine glasses clinked, silver gleamed, conversation resumed, small, clever, harmless. For the first half hour, everything was measured. Market forecasts, real estate trends, the latest Sterling investment in biotech. I nodded when appropriate, answered questions when asked, but the calm felt rehearsed, as if everyone was waiting for a cue. Then Arthur gave it. He set down his glass and looked slowly around the table. Tell me, he said, voice steady, but cutting through the chatter like a wire. What do you all think determines a person's worth? Langford, seated across from me, smiled with the patience of a man who loved being heard. Results, he said immediately. Worth is measurable. Returns, efficiency, influence. Another board member added, Legacy, sir, what we build and leave behind. Arthur nodded once, expression unreadable. Interesting answers. He turned to me. Miss Quinn? Every eye followed. My throat tightened, but I forced my voice steady. I think a person's worth shows in what they do when no one's watching. How they treat people who can't offer them anything in return. The room fell quiet. Even the candle flame seemed to hesitate. Arthur smiled, not the polite kind, but the genuine, almost paternal one I'd seen only once before. Exactly, he said softly. Virtue doesn't demand an audience. It simply endures. Langford chuckled, low and dismissive. A beautiful sentiment, sir, but not exactly a business model. Arthur's gaze snapped to him, mild but razor-edged. Neither is greed, Mr. Langford. It only borrows against decency until the debt comes due. Langford's smile faltered. Around the table, no one breathed. Arthur turned back to me. Miss Quinn reminds us that profit without principle is a ruin in waiting. That's why I've asked her to expand our veteran outreach programs nationwide. A rustle moved through the group. Surprise, confusion, envy. David stiffened beside me. Wait, he said quietly. You didn't tell me that. Arthur's tone was cool, unbothered. You didn't ask. The sentence hit David like a slap. He fell silent, his jaw tight. Arthur lifted his glass again. To integrity, he said. The last currency worth anything. The others echoed half-heartedly. To integrity. I didn't drink. My pulse was still too loud. After dinner, the guests trickled out with handshakes and careful smiles. Langford lingered long enough to murmur something I couldn't catch into David's ear before leaving. Whatever it was, it made him pale. When the doors closed and the echoes faded, only the 3 of us remained. Arthur by the hearth, David by the door, me somewhere between them. Arthur spoke first. Miss Quinn, thank you for your honesty tonight. You made this house feel alive again. I only said what I believed, I replied. That's precisely why it mattered. He glanced at David. You could learn from her, son. She leads with conviction, not calculation. David's shoulders stiffened. And I suppose that makes me what? The example of everything wrong with your empire? Arthur's face softened, though his words didn't. It makes you afraid, David. Afraid of being seen as less than perfect. But perfection is sterile. It can't love, can't serve, can't change. I'm not afraid, David said, but his voice cracked on the last word. Arthur sighed, weary more than angry. Then prove it. Stop defending my approval and start earning your own. He turned to me again. The conversation finished in his mind. Good night, Miss Quinn. You've done more for this family in 3 weeks than most have in years. He left us there, the faint scent of his cologne trailing behind. David didn't move for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his tone was thin, bitter. You think you won tonight, don't you? This isn't a competition, I said quietly. Everything with him is. I stepped closer, but he flinched back. I didn't ask for this, David. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw tears, not anger. That's what scares me. You didn't have to ask. He just gave it to you. There was nothing left to say. He walked away before the silence could answer him. I stayed behind to collect my coat. The butler, as if reading the tension, offered it wordlessly. As I slipped it on, I caught sight of Arthur through the study doorway, standing alone by the fire. His reflection wavered in the glass of a framed portrait, his late wife, smiling faintly beside him in another lifetime. He looked older in that moment, not weaker, but haunted by the weight of understanding too late. Outside, cold wind needled my face as I crossed the courtyard. Somewhere behind me, the mansion lights flickered, an empire blinking, uncertain. When I reached the car, I saw movement in an upstairs window, a silhouette, Langford, on the phone, head bowed toward the light of the screen. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the cadence of plotting. Something in my gut twisted. As the car pulled away, I looked back one last time at the house that seemed to contain every kind of truth. Love, pride, ruin, redemption, all of it glowing behind glass. I didn't know it then, but the story wasn't about who had impressed Arthur Sterling. It was about who would betray him next. The leak hit 3 days later. It started as a whisper on social media. A grainy photo of Arthur Sterling in ragged clothes sitting on a park bench with a caption that read, "Billionaire plays homeless to test kindness." Within hours, news outlets were running it like blood in the water. By morning, the Foundation's inbox was a firestorm of outrage. Morality theater trended. Commentators called him manipulative, tone-deaf, cruel. And through it all, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I arrived at the office before sunrise. Half the staff was already there, faces pale under the harsh lights. Langford's assistant, Elise, stood near the glass wall, pretending not to watch me as she refreshed her phone. Arthur wasn't in his office. Instead, the boardroom lights glared across polished mahogany, where half a dozen directors sat in defensive clusters. Langford led the murmured conversation. When he saw me, his smile was razor thin. "Miss Quinn, good of you to join us." "Where's Arthur?" I asked. "Mr. Sterling," he corrected smoothly, "is dealing with the fallout from his creative exercises. For the time being, the board will be overseeing public communications." I took the empty seat across from him. "So you're shutting him out of his own foundation?" Langford chuckled softly. "I'm protecting it. The donors are furious, and if you care about your position, you'll keep a low profile." "I won't do that." He leaned back, amused. "Of course you won't." The meeting continued, but it wasn't a meeting. It was a slow dismantling. Every sentence carried the sound of doors closing. By the end, Langford had announced an emergency PR review and a temporary freeze on all new veteran programs. As I stood to leave, he added, "Miss Quinn, I'd stay quiet if I were you. Optics matter." "Not as much as integrity," I said, and walked out. Arthur called me that evening, from an unlisted number. "Rough day," he said simply. "You saw the coverage." I did. His voice was calm, almost curious. "You can learn a lot from who turns on you first." "It's Langford," I said. "He's orchestrating this." "I know. You're not going to fight back?" He chuckled softly. "My dear, I've been fighting men like Langford my whole life. This time, I'd rather teach than win." "You could lose everything." Arthur paused. "Then maybe it's time someone else carried the weight. You." "Me?" "You have the trust of the people who matter, the veterans, the volunteers. The soul of this work belongs to you now. I want you to speak for it." "Arthur, if I do that, they'll come for me too." "Then let them," he said gently. "You'll still sleep at night." The line went quiet. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Your father ever apologize?" The question caught me off guard. "Not yet." "He will." Then he hung up. He was right. 2 days later, my phone rang again. Unknown number, a voice I hadn't heard in nearly a year. "Julie," my father said, "it's me." I froze. "Dad?" "Your mother told me about all this. The press, the foundation. Thought I'd call before you end up on the evening news." I braced myself for criticism, but his voice cracked on the next word. "I'm proud of you." I blinked, sure I'd misheard. "You're what?" "I was wrong," he said quietly. "All those years telling you not to waste time on people who couldn't give anything back. Turns out that's the only kind of time that means something." My throat tightened. Dad, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he said firmly. When you joined the Marines, I thought you were running from success. I didn't realize you were running toward something better. There was a pause, the sound of him swallowing hard. Your mother and I, we'd like you to come for dinner. Sunday. No speeches, no judgments, just dinner. For the first time since I was a teenager, I couldn't find words. I'd like that, I whispered. When we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, the city lights painting my window in broken gold. For years, I'd wanted him to understand. I never expected the world to fall apart first for him to see clearly. The next morning, I went to the office early, expecting chaos. Instead, I found Arthur waiting in the lobby, dressed simply in a gray sweater and slacks. His presence quieted the air. He smiled faintly. You look tired. I am, I admitted, but determined. That's the right combination, he gestured toward the elevator. Walk with me. We stepped into the conference room, empty except for the soft hum of the air vents. Arthur placed a folder on the table and slid it toward me. This is authorization to act as interim director of operations. I stared at it. Arthur, I know what I'm doing, he said. Langford wants to play politics. Let him. You do the work. I hesitated. If the board finds out, they will, he said with a shrug. And when they do, they'll have to choose between their image and their conscience. I'm curious which weighs more. He started to leave, then stopped by the door. You once told me kindness could survive in this world. Prove it. When the door closed behind him, I opened the folder. Inside were 3 letters, one to the board, one to the donors, and one addressed to me. The last one read, Julie. When you find yourself standing alone in a room full of people who mistake empathy for weakness, remember this. Empires fall faster than good hearts fail. Carry the mission. Don't carry me. A.S. The press conference happened that afternoon. Cameras, microphones, noise, all the things Arthur hated. I didn't read from his letter. I spoke from memory. I can't speak for the optics, I told the reporters. I can only speak for the truth. Mr. Sterling didn't disguise himself to humiliate the poor. He did it to expose the comfortable. I met him before I knew his name. I gave him a sandwich and a scarf, not because he was rich or poor, but because he was human. That's what this foundation stands for. The room buzzed. Some reporters smiled, others scribbled furiously. Afterward, outside the building, veterans I'd helped waited with coffee and quiet nods. One of them, Torres, the man who'd once refused to sleep under a roof, handed me a folded scrap of paper. Read it later, he said. That night, alone in my apartment, I unfolded it. Inside was a simple message written in shaky letters. You gave me a place to belong. I don't care what they say about him. You both changed lives. I cried then, not the soft cinematic kind, but the messy, unrestrained kind that shakes truth loose from its hiding place. The board called an emergency vote the next morning. Langford looked triumphant when I entered. Miss Quinn, he said smoothly, given the recent PR disaster, the directors have decided to suspend all executive operations until further review. You'll submit your resignation immediately. I slid Arthur's authorization across the table. You might want to read this first. Langford scanned it, color draining from his face. He gave you interim authority? He did, I said calmly, and I intend to use it. One of the other directors, a woman named Chandra, leaned forward. You're really going to continue the programs, even with the backlash? Yes, I said, because while we're arguing about perception, veterans are still sleeping in cars. Silence spread across the table like ink. Then, slowly, Chandra nodded. She's right. One by one, the others followed. Langford tried to protest, but his words dissolved under the weight of his own isolation. When the meeting adjourned, I stepped into the hallway and exhaled for the first time in days. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with something fiercer, resolve. That Sunday I went home. The house smelled of rosemary and nostalgia. My mother hugged me at the door, eyes bright with tears. My father stood awkwardly behind her, hands shoved into his pockets. He didn't speak right away. Then, quietly, you look different. I feel different. He nodded, struggling with the next sentence. I guess I was wrong about what matters. I smiled through the ache. You taught me something anyway. What's that? That sometimes the only way to fix a bad lesson is to live the right one in front of the person who taught it. He laughed softly, eyes wet. Guess the student surpassed the teacher. We ate dinner without arguments, without expectations. Just family, fragile but real. When I left that night, my father walked me to the car. Before I got in, he said, For what it's worth, Julie, I think Arthur Sterling's lucky to have met you. The wind carried the words like a benediction. Driving back through the sleeping suburbs, I felt something loosen inside me. A thread of guilt, unspooled at last. What I didn't know was that the fight wasn't over. Langford wasn't finished. And the next betrayal would come from someone far closer to home. The next week began with quiet that didn't feel safe. The news cycle had moved on, but the damage lingered underneath. Emails unanswered, donors reevaluating commitments, polite smiles that hid distance. Arthur hadn't returned to the office since the scandal broke. David hadn't called. Even the air in the foundation halls felt heavier, as if waiting for another blow. I poured myself into the work. We reopened 2 veteran housing sites, reinstated the outreach line, and scheduled a media briefing to highlight success stories. Progress wasn't loud, but it was steady. That's what mattered. Until Tuesday afternoon. Chandra rushed into my office, face pale. "Julie," she said, holding her phone, "you need to see this." On her screen was an internal memo leaked to a business blog. The headline screamed, "Sterling Foundation in turmoil, new director under investigation." Beneath it, paragraphs twisted half-truths into accusations, misuse of funds, unauthorized expansion, questionable ties to Arthur Sterling. My name was everywhere. Langford's fingerprints were all over it. I swallowed the anger. "Get the board on the line," I said. The emergency meeting was worse than the last. Langford sat at the head of the table this time, a vulture wearing a smile. "Miss Quinn," he began smoothly, "it appears our concerns about transparency were justified. Until we can complete an audit, you'll need to step aside." "I have nothing to hide," I said. "Then this should be easy," he replied, pretending kindness. Chandra slammed her pen down. "This is ridiculous. The programs are thriving." Langford ignored her. "It's about trust, not results." "Trust?" I repeated. "Or control?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. Before I could speak again, the conference door opened. Every head turned. Arthur Sterling walked in, cane in hand, expression unreadable. The room froze. Langford stood, recovering quickly. "Arthur, we weren't expecting—" "I'm sure you weren't," Arthur interrupted. "Sit down." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. He handed Chandra a folder. "I've completed my own audit." Langford frowned. "You don't have the authority." "I built the authority," Arthur said. "And I found something interesting. This memo you leaked." He paused, letting the words hang. "Was written on your assistant's account, using your laptop, on a network registered to your private firm." The silence was almost physical. Langford's complexion drained to the color of ash. Arthur's eyes, cold now, didn't blink. "You thought I'd lost control. You were right. I gave it away. To her." He gestured toward me. "Because I wanted to see who still understood the purpose of this foundation. Clearly it isn't you." Langford stammered, "This is outrageous." "No," Arthur said calmly. "It's over." He turned to the rest of the board. "Mr. Langford is relieved of all duties effective immediately. The Sterling Foundation will continue under the leadership of Director Julie Quinn." A murmur rippled around the table, some shocked, some relieved. Arthur straightened, leaning on his cane. "Consider this our audit of hearts. We've measured intellect and ambition for years. Now we measure integrity." He looked at me, and for the first time since the scandal began, I saw pride, not the shallow kind that feeds on admiration, but the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a seed take root. When the meeting ended, Arthur and I stepped out into the corridor. The hum of the building returned, cautious but alive. He smiled faintly. "You handled yourself well." "I didn't do anything." "You stood your ground," he said. "That's something most people forget how to do once power enters the room." He hesitated then, eyes softening. "You were right about compassion surviving. Sometimes it just needs new armor." I smiled back. "What now?" "Now?" He adjusted his cane, turning toward the elevator. "We rebuild, but slower this time, stronger." The doors closed behind him. I didn't see him again that day. That evening, my apartment was dark except for the glow of my laptop. I opened the foundation's email queue and found a flood of messages. Volunteers offering help, veterans thanking us, donors reinstating pledges. The world hadn't ended, it had shifted. Then an unexpected message from David Sterling. "Can we talk tomorrow at the pier, 6 p.m.? I stared at it for a long time before typing. "I'll be there." The pier was nearly empty at sunset. Seagulls drifted like scraps of paper over the water. David stood at the railing, coat collar turned up against the wind. He looked older than I remembered, less polished, more real. When he saw me, he tried to smile, but it faltered. "You came," he said. "I said I would." He nodded, eyes on the horizon. "I heard about Langford. My father told me what happened." "Your father saved the foundation." "He said you did." I looked away. We both did, in different ways. He exhaled. "I need to say something, Julie." His voice shook slightly. "When this all started, I was scared. Not of losing him, of losing my place. You walked into his world and passed every test I spent my life trying to prepare for. It made me feel invisible." "You were never invisible." "I made myself that way," he admitted. "I thought success meant standing in front of people, not beside them. But when I saw you fighting for that foundation, I realized you weren't competing. You were serving, and I forgot what that meant." He turned to face me fully. "I told Langford about the leak before my father found proof." The words hit me like cold air. "You what?" "I didn't know it was him," he said quickly. "I thought I was protecting the company. I thought—" "David." I cut him off gently, not angry, just tired. "You keep trying to protect the wrong things." He nodded, shame flickering across his features. "I know, and I'm sorry." Silence stretched between us. The waves hit the pilings softly, like measured heartbeats. Finally, he said, "He wants me back on the foundation board, to learn from you." I almost laughed. "You'd really take orders from me?" "I'd rather work beside you," he said, "if you'll let me." I studied his face, the sincerity, the humility, the traces of the man I once fell in love with before ambition built its armor. "Then start by listening," I said quietly. "This work, it's not about redemption, it's about responsibility. If you're here for that, stay." "I am," he said. He reached for my hand, tentative, uncertain. I didn't pull away. In the weeks that followed, change moved quietly but steadily. The Sterling Foundation grew, not in size, but in soul. Veterans led new programs. Staff meetings ended with laughter instead of fear. Even the lobby felt warmer, sunlight catching the bronze plaque Arthur had installed near the entrance. "The audit of hearts. Integrity is the only profit that endures." Arthur visited less often now, letting others carry the mission. When he did come, he'd wander the halls with that same soft smile, listening more than speaking. One afternoon, he stopped by my office. "How's our reformed heir?" he asked, amused. "Learning fast," I said. He nodded. "Good. Maybe he'll teach me something yet." He handed me a small envelope. "For you." Inside was a single line, written in his crisp handwriting. "Keep building bridges. They last longer than walls." When I looked up, he was already gone. That night, I walked home along the river. The city lights shimmered on the water, broken but beautiful. I thought about everything that had unraveled, the tests, the betrayals, the apologies, and how somehow, through all the wreckage, we'd found the shape of something worth keeping. Maybe kindness wasn't fragile after all. Maybe it was the only thing strong enough to survive the fall. I stood there a while, letting the wind whip through my hair before whispering to the night, "Still faithful." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. 6 months passed before the dust truly settled. By then, the Sterling Foundation no longer felt like Arthur's empire. It felt like a community. The veterans we'd once called clients were now partners. Many of them had become mentors, counselors, coordinators. The offices buzzed with purpose, not fear. Arthur's scandal was long forgotten by the press, replaced by newer storms of outrage. But for those of us who'd lived through it, the lesson had carved itself deep. Integrity doesn't expire when headlines do. It multiplies quietly. The winter thawed and spring returned with the smell of rain and renewal. That's when the wedding invitations went out. They were simple. Ivory cardstock, navy ink, no embossed crests or ostentation. Just our names, the date, and at the bottom, the same Latin phrase that had followed me through every chapter of this story. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. We didn't choose a ballroom or a luxury hotel. We chose my parents' backyard, under the maple trees that had watched me grow up. My father built the arch himself, hands steady, eyes determined. When he showed it to me, he grinned the way he used to when I brought home school art projects. "Not bad for an old cynic, huh?" "Not bad at all," I said, hugging him tightly. "You're getting sentimental." "Don't tell your mother. She'll think I've gone soft." He didn't need to worry. She already knew. The day of the wedding arrived with a sky so clear it looked painted. Soft blue, streaks of white. The kind of light that forgives everything. I stood in front of the mirror in my childhood bedroom, hands trembling as I pinned my grandmother's small silver locket near my collarbone. My reflection looked unfamiliar. not because of the dress, but because of the peace behind my eyes. When the door opened, my father stood there in his old Navy suit, the one he'd worn to every important event of my life. "You sure about this?" he asked softly. I smiled. "More sure than I've ever been." He nodded, his voice thick. "You know, I used to think strength meant standing above everyone else. Turns out it means standing with them." I took his hand. "That's all I ever wanted you to see." Guests filled the garden, sunlight weaving through the leaves in golden threads. Among them were faces I'd once only known as case files, veterans who now held jobs, homes, and hope. Some wore suits, others came in jeans, but all of them stood tall, proud. At the front, waiting under the arch, was David. He looked both nervous and grounded, a man who had finally learned to be present. And beside him, sitting in the front row, was Arthur Sterling. Gone was the billionaire armor, the custom suits, the watch worth a mortgage. He wore a simple gray jacket, his cane resting at his side. Draped neatly around his shoulders, like a banner of redemption, was my cream cashmere scarf. When our eyes met, he smiled. That quiet, knowing smile that carried a lifetime of unsaid things. My father whispered as he guided me down the aisle. "He's wearing it again." "I know," I said softly, my throat tightening. "He understands what it means." The ceremony was small and unpretentious. The minister's words floated through the air, weaving between the leaves and the laughter of birds. "I, Julie Quinn," I began, voice trembling. "Take you, David Sterling." When I glanced up, Arthur's gaze caught mine. His eyes glistened, pride and peace mingling like light on glass. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about me and David, it was about all of them. My father, who'd learned compassion, wasn't weakness. David, who'd learned humility, wasn't defeat. And Arthur, who'd rediscovered faith in humanity after losing his faith in himself. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, applause rose like music. Dinner was held beneath strings of golden lights that swayed in the evening breeze. The clink of silverware mixed with laughter and the murmur of old stories retold. When it came time for toasts, Arthur rose slowly, leaning on his cane. The scarf still rested around his shoulders. "I've spent my life building walls," he began, his voice low and steady. "Walls made of marble, pride, and fear. And then one young woman came along and reminded me that the strongest walls are built not to keep others out, but to hold love in." He looked at me. "Julie, you gave me something I thought money couldn't buy. A second chance at being a good man." He raised his glass. "To honor, to kindness, and to being faithful to the values that outlive us all." The guests echoed softly, "To honor, to kindness." I saw my father lift his glass, eyes wet. For the first time, he wasn't just proud of what I'd achieved. He was proud of who I'd become. Later, as the guests drifted away and the music softened into memory, I found Arthur and my father standing beneath the string lights, deep in conversation. Two men who had once lived on opposite sides of the same philosophy, success versus service, now shaking hands. When they returned, my father looked lighter, years younger. "He's not what I expected," he said quietly. "No one ever is," I replied. When night fell and the last sparkler faded, I stood beneath the arch alone. The garden was hushed except for the whisper of wind through the leaves. Fireflies blinked in the dark like small, living stars. Arthur joined me quietly, his step slow but sure. "You know," he said, "I still take those walks sometimes. Sit on that same bench." I smiled. "Do people stop?" "Sometimes," he said, "not often enough." "Maybe someday they will." He nodded. "Maybe, but change begins one person at a time." He reached into his pocket and pressed something into my hand, the bronze medallion he'd given me months earlier. "Keep it close," he said. "Not as a token, but as a reminder. Honor isn't about what others see in you. It's about what you do when no one's watching." I looked down at the medallion. The words gleamed in the soft light. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. When I looked up again, he was already walking away, the scarf trailing softly behind him like a whisper of grace. Later that night, David and I sat beneath the arch my father had built. The candles had burned low, their flames flickering in the gentle wind. The air smelled of lilacs and rain. David took my hand. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think you ruined that first dinner." I laughed. "I did ruin it." He smiled. "No, you saved it. You saved us." We sat in silence then, not the heavy kind that hides words, but the kind that speaks of peace. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed, the same sound that had filled the air the day everything began. Only now I knew it hadn't been chance. It had been purpose. If you've stayed with me this far, I hope you remember this. Every small act of decency matters. We're all someone's test without knowing it. The real measure of a life isn't wealth or rank or perfection. It's compassion. So the next time you see someone the world has forgotten, a veteran, a neighbor, a stranger on a park bench, stop. Smile. Offer what you can. You never know what kind of story might begin there.